Hey guys, Tom Barclay here, back with another video about Tottenham. It's been a few days. I thought I'd do one about transfers and kicking it off with specifically Tottenham's interest in Eberechi Eze. He is a long-term target of the club. They've looked at him for many years and monitored his progress, but it does feel like this summer there is a genuine possibility they may move for him. He is someone that is a serious target for Spurs. Thomas Frank is looking for a new winger. Obviously, Eze can play in a couple of positions, whether it's number 10 or out wide, as he does for England. And Eze, whilst he's not the only target and doesn't necessarily mean that he will definitely move to the club, is one that they're looking at. In the same way, I'm told that Eze himself would be interested in the move to Tottenham. The lure of playing in the Champions League under Thomas Frank is something that appeals to him. But similarly to, as I just said, how there could be other targets that Spurs move for, Eze, I believe, will not just have Spurs as his only option this summer. There are other clubs that are interested in him, and should they move forward with that interest, it's not like Spurs are the only club he wants to play for. So a lot of things are open, but the sort of fundamental takeaway is that he would be interested in making that move, and Spurs are interested in making it happen. I'm told it's not definite that he'll even leave Palace this summer, but there is a very good chance that it could happen. You know, obviously he's someone that's been linked to a lot of clubs in the last few years and has stuck with Palace, but it sounds like this summer there is a chance. Obviously, they're most likely to sell Mark Guehi. Palace quite a clever club in how they do things. They do seem to sort of make major sales most summers, as we saw with obviously Wilfried Zaha before, and obviously last summer with Michael Olise. They don't generally do them all at once. Guehi's the one who's got 1 year left on his contract. Doesn't look like he's going to be signing a new deal. There is a suggestion that he could run down his contract, but you think Palace will most likely would want to cash in on him this summer. So it's not necessarily the case that they will have to sell Eze as well. They probably won't have to do it, but there is a chance that they could do it this year. So as I say, Spurs have been tracking him for a long time. He is someone who famously was released as a kid by Millwall, I believe. If I've got that one right, I'm trying to think of which club released him, but definitely got released by a club when he was younger. Didn't really know what kind of future he would have in the game. Then he went at QPR. He really sort of started to excel. Got his move to Crystal Palace in 2020, and he's just skyrocketed ever since, really, apart from a little period when he had a serious Achilles injury, which came back to a bit too quickly. I remember covering Eze a lot when I covered Palace, but he's generally, apart from that, after a sort of bit of time getting over that injury, he's kicked on massively since then. And last season, and particularly since Oliver Glasner has come to the club, he formed a brilliant sort of dynamic duo with Michael Olise behind Jean-Philippe Mateta. Then when Olise left for Bayern Munich, Eze sort of really took the mantle as the main creator of the team, to Spurs' detriment last season. If you remember them winning 2-0 the week before the FA Cup final, in the build-up to the Europa League final, Palace turns a heavily changed Spurs side over, winning 2-0 as they got both goals. And then he obviously scored the goal in the FA Cup final as well to beat Man City. He's just clearly a big game player who seems to really relish playing football generally. I mean, he's talked about how much he plays the game the way he wants to play. He's a bit of a throwback. He's, you know, in an age of sort of robotic players who are forced into being sort of robotic and fitting into styles. He is a bit more of an off-the-cuff kind of magician, I suppose, player who likes to make things happen and get fans off their seats. And I think he'd be fantastic signing, to be honest, for Tottenham. There's this issue around his release clause. Now, I've seen a few different things being mentioned this week. I believe the figure that I've been told is 60 million, as it was last summer, regarding his release clause. But I'm told it's quite a complex one. It's hard to explain. It's about like the sort of conditions of the deal. I was under the impression before that it was sort of Palace wanting it all up front, but I'm not sure it's quite simple as that. But it is about how the fee is paid, apparently, which is the sort of complexity around the release clause. So it's not as necessarily as simple as just whack down 60 million. Well, maybe it is as simple as that. Most deals don't really happen that way anymore. They're often in installments. But yeah, there's supposed to be a sort of a complexity to this particular release clause, which I'm told. So So that will come into it as well. But yeah, be fascinating to see what you think about Eze. Would he be a perfect signing? Where would he fit in? If you think about Frank playing with a 4-2-3-1, as he often played at Brentford, I know he's played in different formations. That number 10 position you would think which Mikkel Damsgaard played at Brentford would be earmarked, you'd think, for James Maddison, a real sort of technical player with a great eye for a ball, or a Lucas Bergvall, the way he's progressing. But Eze also has a very, very good eye for a pass as well. He's a bit more sort of dynamic in terms of his running, maybe more off the left. I always thought Eze would be a perfect fit for a Postecoglou system, because that left wing position seemed like such a creative role. When you look at Frank's time at Brentford, it didn't feel like the forwards were as heavily relied upon to be sort of creative passers of the ball. They were more the runners, and it was more on the sort of Damsgaard of it in the team, really, to create those chances. But maybe Eze playing out left, particularly if Son were to leave, then and that could be the case. And as I said, Thomas Frank is interested in signing a new winger this summer, and I think a lot of it could be related to the situation regarding Captain Son Heung-min. I did a video recently saying how I'm on the understanding that Son is open to leaving for first time in a long time, ending 10 years at the club. There is a sort of thinking, I believe, in his mindset of maybe going out on a high of lifting the club's first trophy in 17 years, his first trophy in the decade that he's been at the club, has merit to it. There's obviously interest from the Saudi Pro League. Also, I believe there is interest, or so I'm told by Turkish journalists, from Jose Mourinho over in Fenerbahce. Galatasaray obviously made a big signing in Leroy Sané, and I think Fenerbahce need to respond in some way by getting a big name as well. And obviously Mourinho worked with Son at Spurs and was always a huge fan, so I could see the logic behind that. I'm not quite sure if it's definitely the case, but the Turkish reporters I speak to definitely seem to think that is a possibility. And I do think there's a genuine possibility that Sonny could move on. The one thing that I would be very surprised by, though, in terms of a time frame of when Son might leave, would be to see him go before Tottenham's trip to Seoul, to South Korea, in the summer. They're playing Newcastle in Seoul the start of August. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that he couldn't go before then if an offer that Spurs can't turn down comes in. And let's be honest, it will probably be quite a big offer that they'll have to accept, whatever the situation, even though Son's got 12 months left on his contract, just because of the commercial revenue he brings in. But particularly with the main man, the South Korean icon being in the team and them going to South Korea, I think it would be kind of strange if they sold him before that particular tour. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was a bit of waiting on that situation if he is to leave at all. I think it would be most likely after that. But even so, I feel like from what I'm led to believe, speaking to various agents and sources, it feels like a move for a winger is a priority, and also a very likely situation for Thomas Frank this summer. We know that there's big interest in Bryan Mbeumo, the French winger or wide forward who has blossomed under Frank at Brentford, scoring 20 Premier League goals and getting 7 assists last season. I feel like he'd be a fantastic signing for the way I presume Spurs are going to play under Frank. A lot of his tactical setup, we're all assuming at this stage, having not actually seen him take charge of a Spurs game yet, basing it all on how he worked at Brentford. But Mbeumo and his pace and his discipline and also his finishing ability and just all-round quality feels like someone who could really maybe central to the way he wants to play. But who's to say that they can't do the same thing with Brennan Johnson, who he wanted to sign for at Brentford himself. But we'll wait to see where he goes on this particular situation with Mbeumo and Eze. I think there's interest in Antoine Semenyo at Bournemouth as well, although he wouldn't come cheap. It sort of, at this stage, remains to be seen if Spurs were in a position to sign two of those kind of players, where they would both cost, let's be honest, about 60 million in the region of that. I don't quite know if they've quite got the funds to be able to do that, particularly given the fact that they have already just spent 30 million on signing Matisse Tel permanently, who, by the way, seems to be ripping it up for the France under-21s at the under-21 Euros. Scored a great goal against Denmark the other day, and he's obviously someone that that Spurs and Thomas Frank will be looking to develop, presumably out wide left or through the middle. So when you consider all the other players they've already got in these positions, you would think it would be less likely they would move for at least two of them. But anyway, that was kind of what I wanted to say about Eze. But I also want to sort of do a bit of a kind of look at the squad and where I think certain players might leave, where I think certain players might come in. It's a bit of a transfer-y kind of piece. So I think to start off in goal, it's pretty easy, that one. I know there's been a bit of talk about AC Milan's interest in Vicario. I think that was kind of related to, that emanated from Italy, and that was sort of related to if Mike Maignan might move on from Milan. There was interest from Chelsea before the Club World Cup kicked off, but I'm told that Spurs have no interest in selling Vicario, or not planning to this summer, so I'm pretty sure he stays. The only question mark is if Kinski impresses Frank in the summer, and maybe there might be a sort of challenge there from Kinski for the number 1 shirt. Obviously, Brandon Austin's got a new contract, so he's staying. Alfie Whiteman's leaving, and you'd imagine Josh Keeley would leave on loan. So goalkeeper seems pretty wrapped up, unless Frank has a big change of heart once assessing the squad. And it must be emphasised, obviously at this point, Frank hasn't even had his players come back for pre-season yet. So you'd think he'd want to have a good look at the squad, make some decisions then, and there might be players that emerge who he wasn't expecting, or players that might be deemed surplus to requirements who weren't obvious candidates at this point. But obviously at this point I'm only going off what I'm hearing and from sort of assessing the squad. In defence, the obvious question mark surrounds Christian Romero. He's someone that felt like he was sort of agitating for a move last season, but Spurs are now back in the Champions League, where all the top players want to play. He's obviously a World Cup winner and a Copa America winner as well at that. He's got 2 years left on his deal, I believe. And I don't think Spurs are going to be looking to let him go for a cheap fee. I'm thinking sort of more like 60 million. And whether someone like Atletico Madrid, whose interest in him has been widely reported and I've talked about before, would be able to go to that level is questionable. The fact that they haven't got it done before the Club World Cup suggests may give a hint that they'll not be able to do that. So it remains to be seen what happens with Romero. Obviously, he missed a lot of games last season through injury too. If he were to leave, you can be very confident that the Spurs would look to replace him. There's been a lot of talk about Mark Guehi. Obviously, they made an offer for him in the January transfer window, which was a bit of a shock offer right at the end of the window, which sort of hinted at interest in a possibility of Romero moving on, because I can't see them signing someone like Guehi to be a backup, and Van der Ven's not going anywhere anytime soon. So you would imagine they would be back in for Guehi. I do think there is still interest in him, but also there's been talk of Liverpool of late for Guehi, particularly once Jarrell Quansah leaves for Bayer Leverkusen. So that whether Spurs will be able to land someone like Guehi if Liverpool come into the frame is questionable. Also, Newcastle's still there and wanting him as a centre back. You do think Radu Dragozin, looking at it, I know he's just coming back from injury at the moment, of having done his ACL last season. Looking at the way Brentford played under Frank and the centre-backs like Nathan Collins performed, I think someone like Dragozin might flourish more under Frank than he did under Postecoglou's style of play. So I imagine he's got definitely a future on that front. He's one of the few players that met Frank on his first day at Spurs, including James Madders. Basically all the injured players who were in for rehab still were speaking to or introduced to Frank, and you think Dragozin would have a chance. Danzo as well, very much in the picture, having signed permanently this summer when his loan deal got turned via obligation permanent earlier this last month. Obviously Sergio Reguilón's on his way out. He was pretty much the forgotten man anyway, but Spurs are still, when you look at that squad, fullbacks wise, they have a lack of numbers. Obviously Porro, Udogie and Spence, who I imagine all three would likely be retained, and it'd be interesting to see how Frank, who's has been more of a focus on as a coach of defending in training without the ball, compared to Ange, who like to focus mainly on having the ball for most of training or every kind of exercise, what he can do for their games defensively. But you still think with Champions League and the experience of all the injuries last season in the Europa League that they might be one short. And there's also the aspect of their lack of homegrown players to fill the quota needed for the Champions League, which obviously is something that cost them in the Europa League, where Spence himself was left out of the initial squad, and Spurs only could take 23 players in the end rather than 25 because of the lack of homegrown players after selling Oliver Skipp to Leicester for 20 million. So it's not a surprise to see some talk of players who would fit that criteria, former Spurs players, and particularly fullback. So there's the mention of Dennis Shirkin, I've seen, if that's how I pronounce it right, who's done well at Sunderland, got promoted, sort of turned into one of their starting left-back over the last few years. But I think he's only got 1 year left on his contract at Sunderland. So there's been a bit of talk about him being a possible target. And then there's Kyle Walker-Peters, who obviously also came through the ranks. He's leaving Southampton on a free transfer. So I guess it depends if Frank thinks he's sort of up to the task. But he would seem like an obvious answer to that problem, and a free one at that, albeit it depends on how much he wants for his wages. But he's a versatile player, can play both sides, so definitely one to watch on that front. In midfield, Rodrigo Bentancur and James Maddison's ears will have been burning after watching, if they watched Frank's first interview at Spurs as Spurs manager, because he name-checked both of them and talked about how he could get the best out of both of them. So by that rationale, they do seem to be central to his plans at this point. Although you would say with Bentancur, he has still only got 1 year left in his contract. I believe Spurs have been trying to get him a new contract, but until that gets signed, there's always question marks with players with only 1 year left. Whether the club end up cashing in or not if they don't feel like they're going to sign a new contract. But it does sound like Frank rates them as players, definitely. So there's those two. He's also name-checked, unsurprisingly, Archie Gray, Lucas Bergvall, when talking about the youngsters at the club. So you definitely feel like both of them will kick on. And I'd like to hopefully see Gray play more of a midfield role this season. After that, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Yves Bissouma. He felt like someone who, just a few months ago was definitely out the door in the summer, given he had only a year, still at this point only has a year left on his contract. He'd become the forgotten man, unreliable from Postecoglou's perspective. Remember, this is a player who got suspended for the opening game of last season by the club for filming himself inhaling nitrous oxide. But then he came back into it and played an absolutely pivotal role in Spurs winning the Europa League, flourishing in a sort of two-man holding midfield system. And given the way Frank likes one of his midfielders, at least in his system at Brentford, to sort of fill in at left back when he had King Lewis Potter playing left back, but really he's really a right winger, sort of bombing forward. And he used to have Yarmouk, I think it was, sort of dropping into that sort of left back spot. I think Bissouma could be the kind of player who could very much do that. I think Archie Gray makes sense that he could do that. So he feels like one of those players that you'd imagine Frank will have a good look at and see what he can do with him, because there's definitely a quality player in there if you can get it out of him consistently, as proven by his first 6 weeks under Postecoglou, when he was arguably the best player in the Premier League. It was fantastic. But having said that, I still feel like, from what I've heard, that central midfield may be another area where Spurs may look to sign somebody else. And then there's sort of forward. So just like Maddison and Bentancur having their sort of ears burning from that interview, I imagine Dominic Solanke had the same situation, because Frank sort of waxed lyrical about him, said he was a big fan of his abilities and sure he scored loads of goals. So, I mean, it's obvious you don't spend 65 million on a player and not have him central to the way you want to play. So he will be the starting centre forward. It remains to be seen what happens with Richarlison. Last summer, definitely, Spurs, and I think even maybe before then, Spurs are very much open to selling him, particularly if they could get their money back. Remember, this is a once record signing, £60 million. They signed from Everton back in 2022. He's had such a difficult time, whether it be through form in that first season, which he described himself as a shit season. Injuries obviously have crept up all the time. He's had his own mental health problems, which he's gone into in very explicit detail, going through a really tough time. But he also had that period over the sort of Christmas period in Ange's first season where he scored 9 goals in 9 games and really showed his quality. Remember, this is a player who has started for Brazil as number 9 quite a lot. And Ange, to be honest, played him quite regularly when he could and got a lot out of him. Remember starting him left wing in the final itself against United, and also in that Berda semi-final as well. So he liked him a lot, but he just wasn't fit enough. So I would have thought, if Spurs were taking a long-term view on Richarlison, if they got an offer for him that they deemed acceptable, they probably would still sell him because of just the fact that his injury record is what it is. But he also is a good player and an effective player. So again, it could be someone that Frank looks to use. They've obviously signed Tell. I'm told Manor Solomon's going to be getting, as I talked about this a little while ago, before even Frank took over, but I was told that he was going to be given another chance, basically to have a go at succeeding at Spurs, having spent last season on loan at Leeds. Obviously, Timo Werner's left, and I've mentioned the fact that they are looking for another winger. It all just sort of comes back down to Son, really. Son and Romero and Richarlison, none of those players were mentioned by Frank in his opening interview. That doesn't necessarily mean that that they're not in his plans, but they weren't mentioned. It was just noted at the time. And yeah, it feels like his future could well be one of the sagas or sort of recurring or themes that we come back to all this summer, given what he means to the club and the sort of impact he's made, not only with Tottenham, but also in the Premier League. And this is a player who's got 127 Premier League goals. Only 15 players, I believe, have scored more goals in the history of the Premier League. So he's always going to be newsworthy. But that's it, pretty much, to wrap it all up. That's where we're at, as I believe, at this point. Eze, someone, as I say, to recap, is that very much of interest at Spurs. Looks like he fancies the move, or would be open to it. So let me know. What do you think? Who do you think needs to go? Where do they need to improve the squad? What do they need to do? Let me know. I'd love to hear. Cheers, guys. Hey guys, Tom Barclay here again. Just thought I'd do a quick addition to the video because it has some news that's broken this evening. I know this video is going out in the morning, but I recorded my main video, which you will have just watched, hopefully come to the end, before this news happened. So Tottenham have agreed to sign another player. It is in the form of Japan international Kota Takai, if I pronounced that correctly. I'll be honest, it's the first I've heard of him this evening. He is a 20-year-old centre-back, stands at 6'4" tall. He is costing the club £5 million, which is a record for a Japanese player being signed from the J-League. He is due to arrive next month from his current club, Kawasaki Frontale, if I pronounced that right, Frontal. And it's exciting news because I'm led to believe that he will be part of Thomas Frank's first team. That is the plan when he comes over. 2 caps for Japan already. He would be the 16th player from Japan, Japanese player, I believe, to play in the Premier League if he does go on to play in the Premier League. And it takes Tottenham's options at centre-back. Well, they've got a lot, haven't they, now, when you go really all through it. Obviously, in the video I mentioned Christian Romero being the most interesting talking point and what might happen to him if he is to move on. But if he stays, there's Romero, Van de Ven, there is Kevin Danso, there is Radi Dragozin, Ben Davis has signed his option to start, or has had his option triggered for another year, so he's there too. There'll be Kota Takai, now that's 6. There's also Ashley Phillips, who's been out on loan. What does he do when he comes back? And there's also Lucas Vuskovic, if I pronounce that right, who's been doing exciting things over in Belgium and will finally sign for the club. Effective, will finally join the club anyway when he's 18 or turning 18 this summer. A very highly rated young centre back. So obviously they can't have all of them. Some will have to leave.
I still would have thought, I haven't looked into this yet really, that if Romero were to be sold, you know, a sort of Mark Gahey or a really established centre-back would have to come in instead, but I need to do a bit more checking on that. But yeah, exciting news that Spurs have looked to have got another deal over the line, having signed Matisse Tel before. And it obviously sees them dipping into the sort of Far Eastern market, which has served them so well in South Korea, at least. This is Japan, but South Korea with obviously Son Heung-min, and they've signed Yang Min-hyuk also last season, a youngster who went out on loan at QPR, obviously earlier last season, or the season that's just gone. But yeah, Kota Takai, remember the name, and I'll hope to find out a bit more about him for a coming video. Cheers, guys.